buried under 24 sex harassment lawsuits from independent working-class women, a man should face absolute public ruin. Instead, he steps before flashing cameras, smiling warmly to claim a fully guaranteed $230 million reward. The figure standing on that podium is Deshaun Watson. Between the undeniable brilliance of athletic talent and the deep psychological scars inflicted behind locked doors, exactly what price tag has the professional sports machine placed on human morality? This paradox is anchored in a dark reality. It begins with the precise behavior deployed when cameras turn off and doors lock. It escalates through the weaponization of wealth to silence the vulnerable. Ultimately, it exposes a corporate sporting policy that pushes societal trust to the brink, establishing a precedent where profound abuse is merely a temporary public relations hurdle on the path to $250 million. The architecture of a massive deception requires a foundation of absolute purity. Long before the legal documents flooded the Harris County District Courts, the narrative surrounding Deshaun Watson was meticulously engineered to resemble an unassailable modern sporting fable. The setting is Houston, Texas, in the late 2010s. In the American South, professional football operates far beyond the realm of weekend entertainment. It functions as a cultural religion, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise demanding unwavering devotion and exacting absolute perfection from its chosen idols. The Houston Texans, a franchise perpetually trapped in the frustrating purgatory of athletic mediocrity, following years of failed investments in inadequate leadership, were desperately seeking a messiah. They needed a figurehead who could not only win matches, but carry the immense psychological weight of a city deeply invested in the mythos of the gridiron hero. When Watson arrived in the spring of 2017, selected 12th overall in the National Football League draft, he was practically anointed. He stepped onto the field possessing a rare, electrifying vision. He had the broad-shouldered confidence of a 10-year veteran and the charismatic grace of a natural, undeniable leader. The franchise immediately handed him the keys to the kingdom. In return, he delivered spectacular, gravity-defying victories, routinely scrambling out of impossible situations to throw game-winning passes that left massive concrete stadiums shaking. The public was sold a flawless manufactured portrait rooted deeply in his childhood. In 2006, his financially struggling family received a home through the Habitat for Humanity Foundation. This specific, deeply moving historical detail became the impenetrable armor of Watson's personal brand, establishing him as the ultimate underdog who overcame systemic poverty. Upon entering the professional league, he immediately weaponized this saintly persona. When Hurricane Harvey ravaged Houston, he publicly donated his very first game check to stadium cafeteria workers who had lost their homes. The cameras were perfectly positioned to capture the tears and the warm, reassuring smiles. He was meticulously packaged for mass consumption, representing everything pure about American culture, forcing the city of Houston to entrust their civic identity to him entirely. Yet beneath that heavily marketed, obsessively polished surface, a profound and dangerous contradiction was beginning to calcify. A fatal psychological weakness was forming, driven by the intoxicating, suffocating isolation of absolute athletic privilege. When a 20-something athlete is systematically shielded from every ordinary human consequence, handed tens of millions of dollars and treated as an infallible deity by millions of adults, a deeply ingrained, silent arrogance inevitably develops. This quiet, creeping internal conviction dictated that the normal rules of human decency, consent, and basic societal boundaries no longer applied. It manifested as a slow, deliberate, and highly calculated detachment from reality. The environment of professional sports is explicitly, ruthlessly designed to remove all friction from a superstar's life. Upon arriving in Houston, Watson was immediately surrounded by an impenetrable phalanx of agents, financial handlers, public relations experts, and team executives whose sole corporate mandate was to ensure his absolute comfort and protect his monumental earning potential. If he needed a luxury vehicle, it appeared in his driveway. If he required a specific meal at midnight, it was procured by an assistant. If he made a minor social misstep, it was quietly and efficiently erased by professionals before it ever reached the press. The physical reality of his daily existence involved private jets, private stadium entrances, and security details that physically separated him from the general public. He walked through a major American metropolis and never once heard the word no. This hyper-controlled ecosystem breeds a specific dangerous type of entitlement. The athlete begins to view himself not as a citizen bound by laws and ethics, but as a sovereign empire. And an empire does not ask for permission. It takes exactly what it feels it is owed. The disconnect between his internal reality and external presentation was absolute. In front of the microphone, he spoke eloquently of community, respect, family, and discipline. But the physical manifestations of his psychological state told a far more complex and troubling story. Close observers within the facility occasionally noted a cold, unyielding stare when tactical situations did not go his way on the practice field. A subtle, rigid stiffening of his posture when his authority was even mildly questioned by lower-level staff. He commanded his immediate environment with a silent iron will, expecting immediate, unquestioning compliance from everyone in his orbit. The public saw the dazzling photogenic smile and the meticulously tailored custom suits, but they could not see the profound lack of empathy that was hardening within him. He began to operate under the unspoken, untested assumption that his elite status granted him unrestricted, unquestioned access to whatever and whoever he desired, entirely free from the threat of repercussion. The brutal physical toll of his profession provided the perfect, unassailable cover for his emerging obsession. American football is a violently destructive game. Every Sunday, his body was subjected to immense repetitive trauma, requiring constant, intensive, and painful rehabilitation. The Houston Texans provided a state-of-the-art medical facility inside their stadium, staffed by highly trained, heavily vetted, and strictly regulated professional physiotherapists. It was a highly secure clinical environment designed with one singular purpose: to heal and maintain the multi-million-dollar investment that was his body. The franchise employed specialists who possessed a comprehensive understanding of his exact physiological needs, operating under strict medical ethical codes. But he increasingly, deliberately shunned this secure environment. The legitimate medical treatment provided by the franchise was too structured, too professional, and critically, too observant. Beyond physical recovery, he craved absolute, unchecked control over a private, unsupervised space. He sought an environment where he dictated every single term, where the power dynamic was entirely, overwhelmingly skewed in his favor. He began to look far outside the official sanctioned channels, deliberately bypassing the team's medical staff and their rigorous professional standards. He needed individuals who were not protected by a powerful corporate structure, individuals who would be highly vulnerable to his immense wealth, his towering physical presence, and his elite status. He started quietly reaching out into the local community, aggressively searching for independent practitioners. He bypassed established high-end spas, reputable clinics, and sports medicine centers, instead turning to social media platforms, specifically Instagram, to hunt for massage therapists. This specific digital behavior is the crucial turning point. When an elite athlete possessing unlimited resources and access to the finest medical care on the planet spends hours scrolling through Instagram to find unassociated independent massage therapists, the intention is clear. This digital hunt deliberately targeted vulnerability over elite medical treatment. He specifically targeted women who were running small, independent businesses, women who often worked alone in rented rooms or out of their own private homes. These were women who did not have security guards, receptionists, legal teams, or human resources departments to protect them. They were independent contractors whose very livelihoods depended on client reviews, word-of-mouth recommendations, and securing high-profile appointments. When an elite, globally recognized athlete slides into the direct messages of a working-class independent massage therapist offering to book a session, the power imbalance is instantly, dizzyingly profound. For these women, securing a client of Watson's stature could mean vital financial stability and immense professional validation. It is a calculated strike against the vulnerable, exploiting their economic necessity. It was the exact moment the celebrated, community-focused hero began to actively weaponize his immense fame against those he was publicly lauded for inspiring. He was building a parallel life, operating with the cold precision of a predator establishing hunting grounds. The meticulous nature of this operation required constant paranoid attention to detail. He would arrange these meetings at varying obscure locations across the city, sometimes insisting they meet in high-end, heavily secured hotel rooms like the Houstonian, sometimes arriving at their small, isolated private studios. He would arrive a towering, physically intimidating athletic figure, often bringing pre-written non-disclosure agreements or heavily implying the absolute necessity of their silence regarding his visits. The psychological pressure applied to these women before the session even began was immense and suffocating. They were acutely aware of exactly who he was, what he represented to their city, and the crushing, terrifying weight of his civic influence. They knew that his word would always be taken over theirs. If a session went poorly, if they offended him, or if they refused in advance, the implicit threat to their small businesses and personal reputations was palpable. He leveraged his status not just as a wealthy, demanding client, but as an untouchable civic deity. He weaponized the very adoration the city had given him, using it as a shield to isolate and intimidate the women in those rooms. The contrast between the two lives he led is staggering, a drama-filled contradiction that defies basic logic. On Sundays, he was the charismatic general commanding 70,000 screaming fans, leading emotional prayers in the locker room, and presenting a face of unblemished moral fortitude to the national television cameras. He was the man who bought groceries for the poor and inspired the youth. On Tuesdays, his designated days off from the facility, he was systematically scrolling through social media, isolating working-class women and booking private lock rooms where he could establish a terrifying unilateral dominance away from the prying eyes of his handlers. He had created a perfect, hermetically sealed bubble of abuse. He relied on the absolute certainty that the societal worship of his athletic talent would render these women entirely voiceless. He banked on the terrifying reality that no one in Houston, Texas would ever dare to believe a freelance massage therapist over the man tasked with winning the Super Bowl. Up to this point, everything is still okay. The facade held perfectly. The franchise continued to print his jersey. The sponsors continued to deposit millions into his accounts. The city of Houston continued to worship him, completely oblivious to the dark, predatory routine being established in the shadows of luxury hotel rooms and quiet suburban studios. He had successfully built a flawless public empire, but he was actively, obsessively constructing a private world completely devoid of rules, boundaries, or accountability, and that very habit will come back to ruin him later. The brightly lit stadiums effectively concealed the precise logistical machinery operating in the shadows. The narrative had shifted from an athlete's missteps to the architecture of a dark, meticulously organized habit. The sheer scale of the operation required to coordinate 66 different independent massage therapists over a period of 17 months speaks for itself. This is not a number that speaks to a legitimate search for physical healing or athletic recovery. It is a statistical anomaly that speaks to an insatiable, systematic appetite for transient power. In the highly corporate world of professional sports, an elite athlete's body is typically managed by a remarkably small, heavily vetted, and highly trusted circle of medical personnel. A franchise quarterback would have dedicated, salaried physiotherapists who understand the exact tension in his throwing shoulder, the specific elasticity of his hamstrings, and the precise biomechanics of his stride. Yet he actively and deliberately bypassed this multi-million-dollar medical infrastructure. Why would a man whose entire financial existence depends on physical perfection reject the best doctors in the world? Because legitimate medical professionals establish baselines. They enforce clinical boundaries. And most importantly, in a clinical setting, the medical professional holds the power. They dictate the terms of the treatment. Watson was fundamentally rejecting any environment where he was not the absolute, unquestioned sovereign. The mechanism of his search was profoundly modern and deliberately predatory. Bypassing secure concierge services and elite sports management agencies, he turned directly to Instagram. Social media's digital architecture is explicitly designed for self-promotion. Independent contractors within the unregulated fringes of the wellness industry must publicly display their services, locations, and contact details simply to survive the algorithmic competition. By sliding into the direct messages of these small business owners, he was instantly bypassing all traditional corporate firewalls and security protocols. When an account with millions of followers, a verified blue tick, and the cultural weight of an entire city sends a private message to a freelance therapist struggling to pay commercial rent in suburban Houston, the power dynamic is instantaneously and irrevocably shattered. He actively weaponized his immense digital footprint to guarantee compliance and submission before the physical meeting even occurred. The notification on their phones was not just a booking request. It was an intrusion of monumental, intimidating celebrity into their quiet, precarious lives. The demographic and socioeconomic reality of the targeted women reveals a chilling strategy. Far from being salaried employees at luxury downtown spas, protected by security guards and human resources departments, these women were highly vulnerable cogs in the gig economy. Many were single mothers, women working out of spare bedrooms or renting hourly studio spaces in nondescript strip malls. They operated without safety nets, unions, or legal retainers. For freelance therapists, landing a star professional athlete as a client could entirely alter their financial trajectory. It meant guaranteed rent. It meant instant prestige. It meant a glowing, high-profile endorsement that could organically double their local clientele overnight. He understood this economic leverage perfectly. The selection process was a masterclass in exploiting financial desperation. He was preemptively buying their silence with the implicit, dangling promise of career-making patronage, extending far beyond purchasing an hour of their professional time. He targeted the precise intersection of economic vulnerability and professional ambition. The physical logistics of the encounters themselves were orchestrated with a chilling, repetitive uniformity. He would frequently direct these women to meet him at specific locations where he controlled the environment, such as the Houstonian Hotel. But crucially, he would bypass the hotel's actual public spa facilities, insisting instead on conducting the sessions inside his private, locked suite. When a working-class woman steps across the threshold of a luxury hotel room, and the heavy oak door clicks shut and locks behind her, the outside world entirely ceases to exist. Inside that room, he was a physical monolith. He stands at 6 feet 2 inches, weighing over 215 pounds of elite, explosive muscle conditioned for violent impact. The sheer physical disparity between an armored, peak-conditioned professional athlete and an isolated civilian woman is a silent, overwhelming threat in itself. Furthermore, he often arrived at these sessions armed with pre-written non-disclosure agreements. Before a single drop of massage oil was poured, before any physical contact was initiated, the legal intimidation was deployed. He was effectively establishing a private courtroom within the bedroom, preemptively gagging them with the terrifying threat of financial ruin and relentless corporate litigation should they ever dare to speak of what was about to transpire. The testimonies gathered from the civil suits reveal a consistent, terrifying pattern of behavior during the sessions themselves. This manifested as a slow, methodical, and deeply psychological erosion of professional boundaries. He would routinely refuse to use a standard, required medical draping, insisting instead on using only a small, inadequate towel, which he would strategically and repeatedly allow to fall away. He would dictate the physical positioning of the therapist, using his massive frame to force them into uncomfortable, vulnerable, and professionally compromising angles. He would make explicit physical gestures and requests that entirely violated the scope of their clinical practice. The true horror of these encounters lay in the calculated ambiguity he deliberately fostered within the locked room. By constantly pushing the line of decency, retreating slightly when challenged, and then aggressively pushing again, he kept the therapists in a perpetual state of paralyzing confusion, second-guessing, and profound fear. They were trapped in a psychological hostage situation. They were terrified of angering the city's greatest sporting hero, desperately trying to maintain their professional composure and salvage their livelihoods, all while their personal boundaries and physical safety were being systematically, ruthlessly dismantled. After the sessions concluded, the silence was enforced not through explicit, shouted threats, but through the crushing, overwhelming weight of his societal standing. He did not need to verbally threaten them. His status, his wealth, and his cultural untouchability did the threatening for him. The women were left to process the violation and the humiliation in absolute isolation. To whom could they possibly report it? The Houston Police Department, whose officers asked him for autographs. The football franchise that had just invested tens of millions of dollars into protecting his right arm. The local sports media that worshiped the ground he walked on and relied on his success for their own ratings. The structural inequality was so vast, so deeply entrenched in the culture of the city that it rendered them completely mute. They were isolated islands of trauma, returning to their quiet suburban lives, each woman firmly believing she was the only one who had experienced this. They were completely unaware that they were merely one single data point in a sprawling, meticulously organized, and ruthlessly efficient network of abuse. He had perfected a system of exploitation that operated invisibly, running perfectly parallel to his soaring, celebrated public career. It was a dark, self-sustaining loop. Search on social media, isolate in a private room, exploit the economic vulnerability, and rely on the societal worship of his talent to enforce absolute silence. He truly believed his power was absolute, his wealth an impenetrable shield, and the women he targeted completely inconsequential to the grand narrative of his life. But hubris is always a blinding force. A system built entirely on the forced silence of the oppressed only holds its structural integrity until one single person decides they have absolutely nothing left to lose. He had constructed a massive fortress of secrets, operating under the arrogant assumption that the walls of NDAs and public adoration would hold forever. But a secret shared with 66 independent, unconnected strangers is no longer a secret. It is a ticking bomb wired deep beneath the foundation of his pristine public image. And as the calendar turned to the early spring of 2021, the countdown reached 0. The architecture of absolute silence, no matter how meticulously constructed or heavily financed, is inherently fragile. It relies entirely on the premise that fear will perpetually outweigh the human desperate need for justice. For 17 months, the fortress held. Deshaun Watson operated with absolute impunity, shielded by his immense wealth and the blind adoration of a city that viewed him as a flawless civic deity. The 24 women he had isolated and exploited were scattered across Houston, trapped in their own individual prisons of trauma, convinced they were entirely alone. They had been gagged by the sheer scale of his celebrity and the terrifying implication of his legal resources. But on the 16th of March, 2021, the structural integrity of that silent fortress suffered a catastrophic, irreversible failure. The first lawsuit was filed late on a Tuesday evening. Initially, the sports media complex and the rabid fan base reacted exactly as the system had trained them to react, with immediate, aggressive dismissal. The collective instinct of the public was to fiercely protect their idol. The accusations were instantly framed by online commentators as a blatant cash grab, a malicious extortion attempt against a wealthy, God-fearing athlete by an opportunistic opportunist. The power of his carefully curated public persona was so overwhelming that the initial accusation barely registered as a threat. It was treated as a mere nuisance, a temporary blemish that his high-priced lawyers would quickly sanitize and erase. But this was not a singular, isolated grievance. The first lawsuit was merely the leading edge of a devastating avalanche. Within 48 hours, a second lawsuit was filed, then a third. By the end of the week, the number had multiplied at a terrifying velocity. The sports world, previously eager to dismiss the claims, was suddenly forced to confront a rapidly escalating crisis. The sheer volume of the allegations began to pierce the impenetrable armor of his reputation. The defining moment, the midpoint peak that irrevocably altered the emotional trajectory of this narrative and shattered the illusion of a conspiracy, occurred on the 6th of April, 2021. The abstract, nameless legal filing suddenly manifested into a devastatingly human reality. Ashley Solis, a licensed massage therapist and the first woman to file suit, made the excruciating decision to step out from behind the protective veil of anonymity. She sat before a battery of microphones and television cameras, fully exposing herself to the brutal, unforgiving scrutiny of the global media and the vicious retaliation of a fanatical sports culture. During that press conference, the physical manifestation of her psychological state was undeniable. Her hands visibly trembled as she gripped her prepared statement. Her voice, though shaking with residual terror, possessed a devastating, unyielding clarity. She did not speak in the polished, focus-grouped vernacular of corporate public relations. She spoke with the raw, jagged edge of profound trauma. She detailed the systematic violation of her professional sanctuary. "I got into massage therapy to heal people," she stated, her words cutting through the clinical legal jargon. To heal their minds and bodies, to bring peace to their souls. Deshaun Watson robbed me of that. This is the drama-filled contradiction laid bare for the world to witness. Here was a woman stripped of her professional confidence, suffering from crippling panic attacks, her livelihood entirely compromised, sitting in stark opposition to a man who, just months prior, had been signing multi-million-dollar endorsement deals and smiling on national television. Solis articulated the precise, horrifying mechanics of the power imbalance. She was not suing merely for financial compensation. She was fighting to reclaim the psychological autonomy that had been forcefully stripped from her in that locked room. Her courageous public stand was the catalyst. It provided a beacon of validation for the others. Following Solis's testimony, the dam broke completely. The number of civil lawsuits rapidly surged to 24. 24 independent women operating in different parts of the city, many completely unaware of each other's existence until the legal filings became public. Following Solis's testimony, the dam broke completely. The number of civil lawsuits rapidly surged to 24. 24 independent women operating in different parts of the city, many completely unaware of each other's existence until the legal filings became public. The defense would later attempt to isolate and discredit each woman individually, but they could not explain away the eerie, chilling consistency of the 24 sworn affidavits. The defense would later attempt to isolate and discredit each woman individually, but they could not explain away the eerie, chilling consistency of the 24 sworn affidavits. The testimonies mirrored each other down to the most granular, horrifying details. The women detailed the exact same manipulative digital outreach via Instagram. They described the exact same demands for the use of completely inadequate draping. They recounted the exact same deliberate, intimidating movements, the calculated weaponization of his massive physical frame to corner them, and the explicit, degrading requests that shattered the boundaries of clinical therapy. Furthermore, they corroborated the deployment of the non-disclosure agreements, the preemptive legal gag orders designed to terrify them into silence before the sessions even began. The statistical probability of 24 unconnected women fabricating the exact same highly specific, deeply humiliating methodology is practically zero. These consistent testimonies formed a documented, irrefutable blueprint of predatory behavior. The sheer weight of the 24 voices transformed the narrative from a manageable public relations headache into an existential crisis for his career. The public, previously desperate to defend him, was forced to read the graphic, highly disturbing details contained within the court filings. The pristine image of the humble philanthropic hero evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a calculated manipulator operating with systemic impunity. However, the revelation of truth does not automatically equate to the delivery of justice, particularly when navigating the deeply flawed architecture of the American legal system. As the public outrage reached a boiling point, the battleground shifted from the court of public opinion to the rigid, highly technical arenas of the Harris County and Brazoria County grand juries. Here, the fatal weakness of the legal framework when dealing with wealth and influence was spectacularly exposed. It is crucial to differentiate between the burden of proof required in a civil court versus a criminal court. The 24 lawsuits were civil actions, requiring only a preponderance of the evidence, meaning it's more likely than not that the events occurred. But the criminal justice system demands proof beyond a reasonable doubt. When prosecuting allegations of sexual misconduct and harassment that occur behind locked doors without the presence of third-party witnesses, without immediate forensic physical evidence of violent force, and without contemporaneous police reports. Securing a criminal indictment is notoriously, overwhelmingly difficult. The defense strategy immediately exploited this legal reality. They did not need to prove his innocence. They merely needed to inject enough ambiguity, enough technical doubt into the minds of the grand jurors. They weaponized the very nature of his wealth and status. They framed the encounters as deeply regrettable, entirely consensual interactions that had been retroactively twisted by greedy opportunists seeking a massive financial payout from a wealthy celebrity. They relied on the insidious, deeply ingrained societal prejudices that consistently questioned the motives of women who accuse powerful men. In March 2022, after reviewing the evidence presented by the prosecutors, 2 separate Texas grand juries declined to indict Deshaun Watson on any criminal charges. The legal threshold for criminal prosecution had not been met. For the athlete and his formidable legal team, it was framed as a total exoneration, a definitive legal victory that cleared his name. A failure to indict merely reflects the stringent parameters of criminal law, offering no true declaration of innocence. The 24 civil lawsuits remained entirely active, standing as a monumental, unresolved indictment of his morality. The grand jury's decision created a profound, sickening dissonance within the public consciousness. The criminal justice system, bound by its strict evidentiary rules, had officially washed its hands of the matter, effectively declaring that while his behavior may have been deeply unethical, it was not definitively illegal beyond a reasonable doubt. This legal technicality provided the exact loophole the professional sports machinery desperately needed. The moment the threat of prison time was removed from the equation, the moral implications of his actions were instantly discarded by the powers that be. The 24 women, their shattered careers, and their profound psychological trauma were immediately relegated to the status of collateral damage. His physical talent was no longer a liability. It was an asset ready to be aggressively monetized on the open market. The system had successfully insulated its star. He had survived the initial explosion. But the true horror of this narrative was not merely that he escaped criminal prosecution. It was how the corporate apparatus surrounding him immediately mobilized to completely bury the 24 voices under a mountain of legal intimidation and public relations spin. And this is where things really get dirty. The moment the grand jury declined to issue a criminal indictment, a massive invisible switch was flipped deep within the architecture of professional sports. The immediate threat of a prison cell, the only consequence that a multi-billion-dollar corporate machine truly fears, had been successfully neutralized. What remained were 24 civil lawsuits. In the sterile calculating mathematics of corporate crisis management, civil lawsuits are not viewed as moral failings or tragedies of human exploitation. They're simply line items on a balance sheet. They are highly manageable liabilities that can be suffocated with enough capital. And so the crisis machine was fully activated, shifting its objective from proving innocence to systematically dismantling the opposition through financial and legal attrition. While securing legal representation is a fundamental right, this immense legal and public relations apparatus was explicitly weaponized to crush the psychological resolve of 24 working-class women. The disparity in resources was breathtaking. On one side stood independent massage therapists, many of whom were already suffering from severe professional and financial instability caused by the trauma of the encounters. On the other side stood an elite, aggressive legal firm, heavily bankrolled by an athlete whose net worth was measured in the tens of millions, backed implicitly by the sprawling protective shadow of the National Football League. In this context, a courtroom functions primarily as a theater of resources, where the vulnerable are immediately outmatched by corporate capital. The initial strategy deployed by the defense was immediate, aggressive character assassination. Moving beyond simple denial, the defense actively sought to invert the victim-perpetrator dynamic. Press releases were drafted, and public statements were issued that dripped with condescension. The legal team utilized the media to paint a picture of a coordinated, malicious extortion attempt. They framed the 24 women as a greedy, opportunistic cartel looking to cash in on a wealthy, vulnerable celebrity. This is the dark, calculated artistry of legal spin. By consistently using words like extortion, blackmail, and ulterior motives in front of the television cameras, they deliberately seeded doubt into the minds of the public. The system's fatal weakness directly preys upon ingrained societal biases against women who come forward against powerful men. The defense heavily relied on the tragic reality that a significant portion of the fan base desperately wanted any excuse to continue cheering for their quarterback. The lawyers provided that excuse on a silver platter. They highlighted the fact that some of the women had continued to massage him after the initial incidents, intentionally ignoring the complex, paralyzing psychology of trauma and the desperate economic necessity that forces gig workers to tolerate abhorrent conditions just to pay their rent. The defense turned the victim's economic desperation into a weapon against their own credibility. This public relations strategy had a profound physical and psychological manifestation on the women involved. Every time a statement was released calling them liars or extortionists, they were subjected to a fresh wave of digital harassment from the fan base. Their social media accounts, the very platforms they relied upon to run their small businesses, were flooded with vicious threats and degrading insults. They were being punished twice. First in the locked hotel rooms, and second in the public square, orchestrated by the highest paid legal minds in the state of Texas. The contradiction is staggering. The man accused of predatory behavior was shielded behind mahogany desks and custom-tailored suits, while the women who spoke out were left completely exposed to the wrath of a toxic sporting culture. But the true grinding brutality of the crisis machine occurred away from the cameras, within the suffocating confines of the legal deposition rooms. This is where the strategy of attrition is executed. For a civilian, a legal deposition is a terrifying, exhausting ordeal. They're forced to sit in a windowless room, surrounded by hostile attorneys, and recount the most humiliating, traumatic moments of their lives in agonizing clinical detail. They are subjected to hours of aggressive questioning, designed specifically to confuse them, to trip them up on minor inconsistencies, and to break their emotional resolve. Facing this machinery required an unfathomable level of psychological endurance. Their battle extended far beyond Deshaun Watson, turning into a brutal war of attrition against time and diminishing bank accounts. The defense utilized every procedural delay available, burying the plaintiff's legal team under a mountain of motions and paperwork. The strategy was brutally simple: make the process so incredibly painful, so terrifyingly expensive, and so emotionally exhausting that the women would eventually surrender and accept a financial settlement just to make the nightmare end. The crisis machine does not need to win the argument. It only needs to exhaust the opponent. The true depth of this corporate operation lies within the paper trail, specifically the non-disclosure agreements. An NDA is a standard legal tool in the corporate world, used to protect trade secrets or intellectual property, but in this context, it was mutated into an instrument of preemptive coercion. During the civil proceedings, a chilling detail emerged regarding the origins of these documents. The NDAs that Watson had been bringing to these private massage sessions, the legal gag orders he used to terrify women into silence, were not drafted by his own personal lawyers. According to investigative reports, they were provided to him by the director of security for the Houston Texans franchise. This revelation fundamentally changes the entire complexion of the narrative. It shifts the story from the isolated transgressions of a rogue athlete to the deeply troubling realm of institutional complicity. The Houston Texans, a multi-billion-dollar corporate entity that publicly prided itself on community values and moral leadership, had essentially supplied the logistical tools for his predatory behavior. A franchise security director handed an elite athlete a blank NDA template, supposedly after the athlete mentioned a minor privacy issue on social media. A glaring question remains: why does an athlete need a legally binding secrecy agreement for a routine physical therapy session? Medical professionals are already strictly bound by the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which strictly protects patient confidentiality. If the treatment is legitimate, the medical laws already provide absolute privacy. The introduction of an NDA into a massage room serves one purpose and one purpose only: to protect the client from the consequences of his own illicit actions. By providing that document, the corporate entity enabled the behavior, whether intentionally or through a staggering willful blindness. Furthermore, the logistics of the encounters point heavily to a system that facilitated his isolation. Many of these sessions occurred at the Houstonian Hotel Club and Spa, an elite, highly secure facility. Watson did not merely walk in off the street. The Houston Texans had previously arranged and paid for memberships at this exclusive club for their players. It was a perk of the job, a quiet, protected space for the wealthy to exist away from the public. But he actively bypassed the club's actual vetted spa staff, choosing instead to use the secure environment, an environment indirectly facilitated by his employer, to bring in unvetted, independent women from Instagram. The corporate franchise provided the secure location. They provided the legal template for silence. They provided the millions of dollars that created the overwhelming power dynamic. The institution built the fortress. The athletes simply used it. The contradiction between the franchise's public marketing, which heavily featured Watson as a pillar of community virtue, and their private negligence is a glaring indictment of the entire sporting ecosystem. When a corporation views an individual as an indispensable, appreciating financial asset, their capacity for moral oversight entirely evaporates. They did not buy his innocence. They purchased their own plausible deniability. They looked the other way because looking directly at the problem would mean jeopardizing their chances of winning a championship. As the months dragged on, the sheer weight of the legal onslaught began to achieve its intended devastating effect. The trial dates were continually pushed back. The public fatigue set in. The media cycle, always hungry for fresh outrage, began to slowly move on. The 24 women who had bravely stepped forward seeking accountability found themselves trapped in an endless, agonizing legal purgatory. The psychological toll of living constantly within the trauma, of having their characters debated on national television, and of facing the relentless hostility of the defense attorneys was crushing. Slowly, methodically, the crisis machine began to close the loop. In the summer of 2022, the announcements began to trickle out through tightly controlled press releases. Confidential settlements were being reached. 20 of the 24 lawsuits were settled out of court, then 3 more. The exact financial figures were carefully hidden behind strict confidentiality clauses. A final, ironclad layer of silence purchased with NFL money. These out-of-court settlements functioned as calculated, transactional maneuvers designed solely to eliminate a threat, offering neither an admission of guilt nor an apology. The crisis machine determined the exact monetary value required to make the problem disappear from the public docket. For the women, accepting the settlement was often a matter of sheer survival, a desperate attempt to reclaim some fractured semblance of peace and move on with their shattered lives. The money provided financial security, but it came at the terrible cost of their voices. The settlements legally bound them to never speak of the encounters again. The system had successfully bought back the silence it had temporarily lost. The legal hurdles were essentially cleared. The massive civil liability had been reduced to a manageable, finite expense, easily covered by the deep pockets of a superstar athlete. The Houston Texans, eager to completely wash their hands of the mounting public relations disaster and completely detach themselves from any lingering institutional blame, quietly made their own separate settlements with the women, purchasing their own release from the legal crossfire. The path was now entirely clear. The messy human reality of the 24 victims had been successfully sanitized, categorized, and filed away into sealed legal vaults. The athlete was no longer a defendant facing an existential threat. He was simply a highly valuable commodity whose legal baggage had been neatly paid off. The crisis machine had done its job flawlessly. It had protected the asset, and in doing so, it set the stage for a spectacular, almost incomprehensible display of corporate greed. The system had not merely forgiven him, it was preparing to reward him on a scale never before seen in the history of the sport. But the plot twist arrives in the spring of 2022, when the rest of the league, having watched this moral catastrophe unfold, decided they wanted a piece of the action. The moment the legal threat of a criminal conviction was eradicated by the Texas grand juries on the 11th of March, 2022, a grotesque spectacle immediately commenced. The 22 civil lawsuits that remained entirely active at that precise moment, filled with harrowing sworn testimonies of systemic abuse and coercion, were instantaneously rendered invisible by the executive branches of the National Football League. In the sterile calculating mathematics of corporate sports, the absence of a prison sentence is viewed as a green light for acquisition. The morality of the individual was entirely irrelevant. The only metric that mattered was the undeniable elite capacity of his right arm. A frantic, undignified scramble erupted among several billion-dollar franchises. Rather than distancing themselves from the controversy, the Carolina Panthers, the New Orleans Saints, the Atlanta Falcons, and the Cleveland Browns aggressively courted it. The billionaire owners and top-tier executives of these organizations boarded their private jets and flew directly to Houston. They arrived to make presentations, to essentially beg for the services of a man accused by 24 working-class women of profound, predatory sexual misconduct. The staggering institutional eagerness to trade for him revealed the true depth of the moral failure. These elite corporate leaders sat across from him in luxury boardrooms and actively competed to offer him the keys to their respective cities. They had collectively, seamlessly rationalized that the lack of a criminal indictment equated to total exoneration, deliberately and callously stepping over the active trauma of the victims to secure a competitive advantage on the football pitch. The eventual victor of this morally bankrupt auction exposed the true depth of this systemic failure. The Cleveland Browns are a franchise defined by decades of historical failure, administrative incompetence, and profound athletic desperation. They'd spent over 20 years searching for a savior, cycling through dozens of inadequate quarterbacks, trapped in a relentless cycle of losing. This deeply ingrained organizational desperation is the fatal weakness of the corporate entity itself. When an organization is that utterly starved for success, its ethical guardrails are the first things to be dismantled. The Browns were willing to endure any level of public relations toxicity if it guaranteed them a formidable presence in the playoffs. Acquiring Deshaun Watson required them to offer an unprecedented, history-altering financial package to convince him to choose their perpetually struggling franchise over the more stable alternatives. On the 18th of March, 2022, the Cleveland Browns won the auction. They traded 3 first-round draft picks to the Houston Texans, mortgaging their entire athletic future for the rights to the player. But the trade itself was merely the preamble to the true catastrophe. To secure his signature, the Browns handed him a 5-year contract worth exactly $230 million. The raw number is staggering, but the true horror lies in the contractual structure. Every single penny of that $230 million was fully guaranteed at signing. This was a seismic, unprecedented event in the history of American professional football. Unlike other major American sports, NFL contracts are notoriously fluid, heavily reliant on performance incentives and injury clauses, with very little money actually guaranteed over the long term. The billionaire owners of the league had spent decades fiercely protecting this system, refusing to hand out fully guaranteed long-term contracts to preserve their own financial leverage. Yet the Cleveland Browns shattered this foundational economic principle, not for a pristine, universally beloved hero, but for a player facing over 20 active sexual harassment lawsuits. This financial commitment was a profound statement of values. The franchise looked at the detailed, horrifying affidavits of 24 independent women and responded by handing the accused the most secure, bulletproof financial fortress ever constructed for a football player. The structural engineering of this contract reveals an even deeper, more insidious layer of corporate complicity. The Browns' front office executives, highly educated men armed with advanced degrees in analytics and law, knew with absolute certainty that the National Football League would eventually be forced to suspend Watson for violating the league's personal conduct policy. It was an unavoidable public relations necessity for the league. When a player is suspended in the NFL, they forfeit their game checks, which are calculated directly from their base salary for that specific season. Anticipating this disciplinary action, the Cleveland Browns deliberately manipulated the architecture of the contract to shield his wealth from the league's punishment. They structured his massive new deal so that his base salary for the first year, the year the suspension was guaranteed to occur, was exactly $1,035,000. The vast majority of his compensation for that year was converted into an enormous signing bonus, paid out immediately and entirely immune to game check forfeiture. They essentially prepaid his fortune to ensure that a massive suspension would barely make a dent in his actual bank account. This is the dark, intricate machinery of elite sports management. The front office did not just acquire a player, they actively conspired to protect his financial empire from the ethical consequences of his own predatory behavior. The public introduction of the player in Berea, Ohio, stands as a masterclass in cognitive dissonance and corporate gaslighting. The billionaire owner, Jimmy Haslam, and the general manager, Andrew Berry, sat beside their new acquisition, facing a hostile press corps. The physical manifestations of their immense discomfort were glaring. They shifted restlessly in their chairs, their eyes darting away from the cameras, delivering heavily rehearsed, legally vetted statements about conducting extensive background research. Yet when pressed by journalists, they admitted they had not spoken to a single one of the 24 accusers. They had not spoken to the women's legal representation. Their extensive research consisted entirely of relying on the criminal grand jury's decision and speaking with Watson's own highly paid defense team. They had consciously chosen a state of willful blindness, burying their heads in the sand of their own ambition. During that press conference, Watson himself sat perfectly composed, wearing a tailored suit, his voice maintaining its characteristic soft, steady cadence. He looked directly into the cameras and reiterated his absolute innocence, claiming he had never disrespected or harassed any woman in his life. The gap between what the public was watching and the deeply documented reality of his actions was chilling. He was entirely insulated by the men sitting next to him, protected by a wall of $230 million guaranteed dollars. The disciplinary theater orchestrated by the National Football League that followed was merely a bureaucratic pantomime designed to placate the outrage of the general public. The league appointed an independent disciplinary officer, a former federal judge named Sue L. Robinson, to review the evidence and determine the punishment. Following a rigorous examination of the facts, Judge Robinson released a comprehensive 16-page report. Her written conclusions were devastating. She explicitly categorized Watson's behavior as egregious and definitively predatory. She stated that the NFL had successfully proven that he engaged in sexual assault as defined by the league's own conduct policy, yet bound by the historical precedent of previous, far more lenient NFL disciplinary actions. She issued a suspension of only 6 games. The public backlash was immediate and ferocious. The sheer inadequacy of a 6-game penalty for predatory behavior against 24 women exposed the horrific inadequacy of the league's moral compass. Attempting to salvage its own bruised reputation, the NFL exercised its right to appeal the decision of its own appointed judge, pushing for an indefinite suspension. Eventually, a settlement was reached behind closed doors between the league and the players' union. Deshaun Watson would be suspended for 11 games and heavily fined. The fine was set at exactly $5 million. This was a grotesque spectacle. The mathematics of this punishment are a direct insult to human intelligence. Placing these figures side by side reveals the severe disparity. $5 million against a fully guaranteed sum of $230 million. It represents a penalty of slightly more than 2% of his total contract. For an ordinary citizen, an equivalent fine would be akin to a minor parking ticket. The $5 million functioned strictly as a highly negotiated public relations tax. It was the precise cost of doing business, the fee required to purchase the illusion of accountability while ensuring the core asset remained intact and immensely wealthy. The league essentially declared that the psychological trauma, the shattered careers, and the deep humiliation of 24 women were collectively worth exactly 11 football matches and a fraction of the perpetrator's signing bonus. The message broadcasted across the globe by this sequence of events was unequivocal. For the 24 women sitting in their Houston homes, turning on their televisions to see the man who had cornered them in locked hotel rooms holding up a New Jersey flanked by smiling billionaires was a devastating psychological blow. They watched as the very system that they had bravely attempted to expose stepped in to reward their abuser with unimaginable wealth. The message sent to society was entirely unambiguous. If an individual possesses a rare, highly monetizable physical talent, the elite corporate structures of America will not simply excuse their transgressions. They will actively protect them, finance them, and elevate them to the highest peaks of luxury. The ethical boundaries of society apply only to the replaceable. The indispensable are entirely exempt. The system had performed flawlessly. The crisis management team had settled the lawsuits. The general manager had structured the contract to bypass the fines. The owner had absorbed the public criticism. The National Football League had executed its disciplinary theater and closed the book on the matter. The financial fortress was completely impenetrable, But the architecture of professional football contains a brutal, unavoidable equalizer. The corporate apparatus can manipulate the media, it can purchase the silence of the accusers, and it can guarantee the money, but it cannot guarantee the functionality of the human body. The very instrument that had earned him this unprecedented fortune, the physical perfection that had rendered him utterly untouchable by the laws of man, was about to fail him entirely. The stage was perfectly set for a collapse that no amount of guaranteed money could prevent. The 11-game suspension expired in the late autumn of 2022. The corporate theatrics had concluded. The fines had been quietly wired, and the National Football League officially reinstated Deshaun Watson. The stage was set for his highly anticipated return to the pitch. In a twist of scheduling that felt almost too aggressively scripted by fate, his very first game back was played in Houston, Texas. He was returning to the exact city where the fortress of his public persona had been built, and the exact city where he had systematically exploited 24 independent women in locked hotel rooms. The atmosphere inside the stadium that afternoon was profoundly toxic, a swirling, visceral manifestation of a fractured sporting culture. The fans who had once worn his jersey like a badge of civic pride now rained down a relentless, deafening chorus of boos every single time he stepped onto the grass. The man who had once been hailed as a messiah was now a villain, returning to the scene of his moral crimes draped in the colors of a rival franchise. But it was his physical manifestation during that game and throughout the remainder of the season that revealed the deepest, most profound contradiction of this entire saga. He had secured the $230 million. He had successfully outlasted the legal system. He had acquired the ultimate impenetrable financial shield. Yet when he gripped the football and surveyed the opposing defense, the magic was entirely unequivocally gone. The player who took the field in Cleveland Browns colors looked entirely diminished. The broad-shouldered confidence and the electric improvisational brilliance that had once captivated the nation had completely evaporated. He appeared hesitant, visibly sluggish, and completely disconnected from the rhythm of the game. He threw passes into the dirt. He misread basic defensive coverages. He looked like a man who had spent 2 years fighting in deposition rooms instead of studying playbooks. A man weighed down by an invisible, suffocating pressure. This is the ultimate irony, the devastating reality check that no billionaire owner can manipulate. A corporation can purchase the silence of the accusers. A general manager can structure a contract to bypass league fines. A highly paid legal team can completely sanitize a public relations disaster. But the architecture of professional sports contains a brutal, unavoidable equalizer. You cannot legally mandate athletic brilliance. You cannot write a contract that prevents the deterioration of human instinct. The mind and the body are inextricably linked. And his body was beginning to betray the massive financial investment that had been placed upon it. The decline marked the beginning of a catastrophic physical unraveling. As the 2023 season commenced, the Cleveland Browns desperately needed their $250 million acquisition to justify the moral compromise they had forced upon their fan base. Instead, his body began to violently break down. The fatal weakness of his absolute arrogance, the belief that he was entirely untouchable, was now violently colliding with the frailties of human biology. In a sport defined by high-speed collisions, the quarterback's right shoulder is the most valuable, fragile piece of real estate on the field. Midway through the 2023 campaign, Watson suffered a devastating injury, a displaced fracture in the glenoid, the socket of his throwing shoulder. The very anatomical instrument that had earned him the unprecedented fortune, the physical perfection that had rendered him utterly immune to the standard laws of human decency, was fundamentally cracked. He was forced to undergo immediate season-ending surgery, and the corporate franchise was left completely paralyzed. The Cleveland Browns front office, the men who had aggressively mortgaged the entire future of their organization, were forced to sit in their luxury suites and watch as journeyman backup quarterbacks led their team into the playoffs, completely exposing the fact that the massive investment in Watson was entirely unnecessary. They had sold their institutional soul for a ghost. The disaster deepened exponentially as the calendar turned to the 2024 season. He returned from the shoulder surgery, but the physical degradation was now painfully obvious to millions of viewers. He was statistically ranked among the absolute worst quarterbacks in the entire professional league. He could not throw the ball with accuracy. He could not escape the oncoming defenders. The fan base in Cleveland, a group of people who had been asked to swallow their moral objections in exchange for championship glory, turned on him with a vicious, unyielding fury. This highlights a horrifying reality regarding the psychology of sports fandom. The fans did not turn their backs on him because they suddenly experienced a moral awakening regarding the 24 women. They did not relentlessly boo him because they cared about the trauma inflicted in those massage rooms. They turned on him strictly, exclusively because he was losing football matches. If he had thrown 40 touchdowns, the stadium would have worshipped him. The morality of the situation was entirely irrelevant. It was the athletic incompetence that they found unforgivable. The climax of this physical and athletic collapse occurred on the 20th of October, 2024. During a routine play against the Cincinnati Bengals, Watson dropped back to pass. There was no violent collision. There was no massive defender crashing into his legs. He simply planted his right foot into the turf, and a catastrophic physiological failure occurred. The Achilles tendon in his right leg completely ruptured. He collapsed instantly onto the pitch, writhing in sheer, unadulterated agony. As the medical staff rushed onto the field and the motorized cart was brought out to carry his broken body away, a deeply unsettling sound cascaded down from the concrete stands of the Cleveland Stadium. Thousands of fans were actively, loudly cheering his severe injury. They were celebrating his physical pain. It was a bleak, disturbing tableau. The fallen Titan, weeping into a towel as he was driven into the stadium tunnels, surrounded by the venomous cheers of his own supporters. This is the transactional, soulless nature of the sporting machinery stripped bare. They had never loved him. They had only loved what they believed he could do for them. And the moment his body failed, he was discarded, treated with the same cold, calculating indifference that he had once shown to the women he targeted. The financial reality of this physical collapse represents the ultimate, inescapable trap for the Cleveland Browns. They are trapped in a prison of their own making, bound by the rigid laws of the league salary cap. Every single time he limps off the field, the executives stare into a financial abyss. Because they fully guaranteed the $230 million, they cannot simply release him from his contract. If they were to cut him from the team, the financial penalty, known as dead cap space, would be so astronomically high that it would completely bankrupt the team's ability to sign other players for years to come. They cannot trade him because no other franchise on the planet would willingly absorb that catastrophic financial burden. They are contractually handcuffed to a broken, widely despised asset. The safest, most player-friendly contract in the history of professional sports has mutated into the most dangerous, destructive liability in the history of franchise management. The Browns believed they were purchasing a championship window. Instead, they purchased a decade-long competitive coma. The universe delivered a devastating, uncompromising verdict that the legal system could not. The resonance of this unprecedented moral auction extends far beyond a single ruptured Achilles tendon on a Sunday afternoon in Cleveland. The enduring tragedy of the Deshaun Watson saga is not found in his physical decline, but in the chilling permanent legal and cultural precedents it established across the landscape of American professional sports. The financial realities facing the Cleveland Browns serve as a grim mathematical monument to their ethical bankruptcy. Staring into the 2025 and 2026 seasons, the franchise is suffocating under an astronomical dead cap hit that mathematically prohibits them from fielding a competitive team. It is a corporate suicide pact signed in the pursuit of a moral shortcut. Yet the most profound and haunting aftermath of this ordeal resides far away from the luxury executive suites. The focus must shift entirely back to the 24 independent women forcefully drafted into this terrifying spectacle. Following the confidential settlements, the vast majority of these women were forced to entirely abandon the massage therapy profession. The sanctuary of their clinical practice had been fundamentally destroyed. The digital harassment orchestrated by legions of faceless fans protecting their athletic idol did not simply vanish when the non-disclosure agreements were signed. For many, the psychological toll of the prolonged legal warfare, the vicious public character assassinations, and the crushing realization that the justice system had abandoned them proved insurmountable. They were financially compensated, but their careers, their professional identities, and their sense of bodily autonomy were irrevocably shattered. Ashley Solis, the brave therapist who first stepped in front of the cameras and shattered the terrifying silence, has spoken publicly about the permanent anxiety that now dictates her life. The panic attacks did not cease with the settlement check. The fear of being in a locked room with a stranger remains a permanent psychological scar. This is the ultimate chilling truth that the sports broadcasting networks will never display on their glowing television graphics. That unprecedented financial fortress did not just buy Deshaun Watson a place on the Cleveland roster. It essentially funded the erasure of 24 working-class women from the public consciousness. The stadium lights eventually turn off, the crowds filter out into the cold night, the corporate sponsors tally their quarterly profits. But in quiet, nondescript suburban homes across Texas, 24 women are left to silently carry the devastating, invisible weight of a society that looked directly at their trauma, calculated its precise market value, and decided it simply was not worth the cost of losing a football game. The executives who orchestrated this machinery will eventually retire to their gated estates. The broadcasting networks will seamlessly pivot their cameras to the next rising star, but the ledger of history remains strictly unforgiving. The sworn testimonies archived in the Harris County courts stand as an immutable testament to institutional failure. The ultimate tragedy is not a broken system, but one that functioned exactly as designed, protecting the elite asset, silencing the vulnerable, and consciously financing exploitation above human cost. The saga ends not with cinematic justice, but with a haunting reality. The sporting machine looked directly into an ethical abyss. It paid $230 million to cover it up. And then it simply waited for the next kickoff,